to Drupal Camp Asheville. I'm so excited to be here. This is my second year coming here, and my second presentation here. Second time presenting at Drupal Camp Asheville, I should say. We are talking about JSON API 2, which has just been put into Drupal core in 8.7. And we are going to be talking about it as a context for decoupling Drupal. Show of hands, who are my devs in this room? All right. Who here has worked with JSON API before? Who here has worked with JSON API in core? All right. Excellent. Why are you here? Go to a different... I probably have...
You never can learn enough.
Yeah.
You got to validate that you're doing things right.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. A little bit about myself. My name is Erich Beyrent. I am a senior Drupal developer at BioRaft, which is based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Fun fact about me, I've been working with Drupal since 4.6, and I just celebrated 14 years on Drupal.org. So I've been working with Drupal for a long time. I have core contributions, contributed modules, and I've got patches and contributions to Drupal, to JSON API as well. I've been working with JSON API for about a year and a half now, back when it was a contrib module, and every single time they pushed a change, it broke everything. Now it's in core, and I'm so happy because that means it'll be a little bit more stable. But seriously, huge props to all the people who are working on JSON API, Wim Leers and Gabe and everybody else. I couldn't be happier. And the API First Initiative. A little bit about my company, BioRaft. BioRaft is a company that does, we provide an integrated portal for training and safety compliance for researchers at laboratories all around the country and overseas. We empower organizations with a single, easy-to-use system that improves laboratory safety, increases efficiency, and facilitates collaboration between environmental health teams and the researchers. Basically, we help prevent the zombie apocalypse. You know, every time you see an accident in the lab, and then all of a sudden you got zombies running all over the place. It is a software as a service, and it is running entirely on Drupal. Fun facts. And we're hiring. We are hiring interns. We are hiring entry-level developers. We are hiring mid-level developers. So if you have an interest in doing something really cool and helping save people's lives, come find me and let's talk. All right, what is JSON API? This is really cool. We're going to talk about that as part of our agenda. We're going to talk about why we're using JSON API instead of some of the other alternatives. We're going to do an overview of JSON API. We're going to talk about authentication, and particularly with JWT. We're going to talk about how to do basic requests, how to do filters, sorting, pagination. At that point, I'm going to stop the recording, switch over to a demo that I put together, and then restart the recording. So there'll be a little bit of jangling there. We'll talk about file uploads and image derivatives. We'll talk about some gotchas. Okay, so JSON API started its life out as a specification. And then it was quickly adopted as a contributed module, and it was always intended to go into core. The maintainers of this module started off by saying, this is such an important new thing, we want this in core. And that's where they always work towards, and now finally it's happened as of 8.7. JSON API is a specification that Drupal now implements, as we said. It's designed to be readable and flexible and discoverable. So what's really cool is when you enable Drupal's JSON API implementation, and you have other modules like Schemata or some of those other things, now you've got a self-publishing API that is easily discoverable. Your clients and your users can actually read the API, and it even generates its own help docs, which is really cool. It is specifically designed to minimize the number of requests and the amount of data transmitted, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we talk about the differences between JSON API and REST, and we talk about some of the features that are built specifically into JSON API. One really cool thing is it does provide its new INA registered media type, so all of your requests will have an accept header of application/vnd.api plus JSON, and we'll have that same thing as a content type header. And in fact, It's a little inconsistent in Drupal core. Some requests you can make without putting those in the headers, and it works out just fine. And then some of them, Drupal says, I don't know what to do with all this. But basically, the way it's supposed to work is if that's in the header, the JSON API module intercepts that and then takes over the routing from there and handles all that other stuff. So JSON API really is a standard that's built on top of JSON objects, and it is a standard for how JSON requests and responses should be formatted. So if you've ever, and we'll talk about some of the differences between this and Core's REST, but if you've ever worked with Core's REST, you'll notice that you're going to get different responses. You're going to get different formats. Every single response looks different. There's no standard. JSON API provides that standard. A lot of times people will go and they'll put in their own kind of REST endpoints or whatever, and they'll have a slightly different format. Now you've got an argument on your team about, oh, we should use this format or we should use this format. Well, this is the new spec that we should be using. And clients that are built on JSON API are able to take advantage of its features like efficiently caching responses. And sometimes, in some cases, you can actually eliminate additional network requests. So for performance, it's really great if you're building a client that's consuming this JSON API data. So JSON API gives us high productivity because it's consistent, it's readable, it's predictable. It's designed to minimize the number of requests to the server by using includes and related resource objects. It has efficient use of caching, so when you go and you request a resource object and that gets rendered or mutated into a JSON object, that gets cached. It's got great filtering, pagination, and sorting right out of the box. You get all of your related resources in one request, and what's really, really cool is this supports sparse field sets. So if you only need one particular field or maybe a small group of fields, you can specify just what fields you want so you get a smaller response object. Makes it faster, right? And more responsive. However, the caveat to that is when you're using sparse field sets, the responses are not cacheable on the server side, so you have to do some of that kind of work on the client side. They used to say that JSON API is zero configuration out of the box. That's not completely true anymore, and I'll talk about that. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about there. Okay, so why not Core REST? Core's got this whole REST functionality built right in, right? You can go right to node/1 and get a REST object if you specify the underscore format equals JSON or format equals XML or CSV, that kind of stuff. So let's say that you go do that, and so you get this article. It's node 1, and you get all the information about node 1. But now you also want information about this article's author, like their email address and that kind of stuff. Guess what? That's not in the response. Now you have to go make a second request out to user/123 to get their information, right? Now let's say that the node has the article has related taxonomy or other things. There's n number of additional requests that you need to make. So multiple requests are needed for common needs. And I put an asterisk on that because the caveat to that is what do we do? What do we do? We build a view, right? That has all the data. We add a REST display, and that has all the fields that we want. So now for every single one of these things, you now need to go build a view, right? Not so great. Responses tend to be bloated because all the data is in there, including things that you might not need. In general, Core's REST doesn't follow any widely accepted guidelines or specifications. Different modules do different things and have different response formats. Even the data structures with them are not consistent. It doesn't support sparse field sets, again, unless you go and you build a view, expose a REST display, it specifies just those fields you need. But then you can't control that dynamically on the fly. There's no bulk writing of data, right? You can't go and create a whole bunch of things in one request like you can with JSON API. Configuration, who's ever tried to configure REST endpoints in Drupal? Right, you need a separate module, right? Unless you can go and write YAML files from scratch. Not my forte. So an additional module just to configure the thing. And there's no support for decoupled filtering. What does that mean? If you want to have a bunch of filters on your data, again, you build a view, you add a REST endpoint to that, and you have to add in a number of filters, and you have to expose those filters. But then your clients only have access to the filters that you've exposed. So now all of a sudden, your customer says, well, geez, I'd really like to be able to filter by this. Now you got to go back, edit your view, republish it, all that other stuff, export it. It's kind of a pain in the butt. So then GraphQL. GraphQL is super cool and it's super powerful, but it often requires additional extra infrastructure. It's really optimized for read operations. Write operations are more expensive and require additional tooling. Extra work is needed to be able to use CDNs or browser caches, so that's not so great. Your clients often need additional libraries in order to parse the data and to deal with the data. GraphQL queries can be super large, and that's really, really common. And it's not that JSON API doesn't have some of those same challenges, and we'll talk about that and talk about a solution for that. But GraphQL tends to be more common. GraphQL's got so many big features, but you often have to add other tools to your servers in order to support that. So now you've got a bigger infrastructure footprint. And then you often have to put in additional permissions and configuration and custom code just to get things working the way you want them to work in. Especially when using persisted queries. Clients don't have control over the queries filters, so you have to add an extra tooling. It ends up being a lot more like the REST solution. So that's a problem. All right, so going to JSON API. And when they say it has zero configuration, that used to be the case. You used to just be able to enable the contributed module, and boom, it just worked out of the box. Now that it's in core, for security, they have opted to configure it in read-only mode. So if you, and that works for a lot of use cases, right? If you are only building clients that are fetching data display in an app or in some other tool, this works for a lot of cases. However, if you're creating a fully decoupled app where you want to be able to update data and delete data or create data, you need to configure it in rewrite mode, which is that second radio button. Another piece of configuration. If you want to be able to see how many resources were found as part of a query, the total number of resources, you need the JSONAPI Extras module. And that provides this additional configuration, include count and collection queries. If you are building an application and say you want one of those traditional pages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that slides and all that kind of stuff, you kind of sort of need to know how many total results were found. JSON API doesn't do that out of the box because it does add extra load when doing the queries. But for the stuff that we do at BioRaft, we find it extremely useful and helpful. The other really, really cool thing that JSONAPI Extras does is it allows you to change the path prefix. So by default, all of your requests go to this prefix /JSONAPI. I tend to prefer to go to /API. Some people want to go to /REST. Some people want to go to whatever. One thing that I think is going to really help with this, one of the gotchas is that JSON API doesn't have versioning. It doesn't have versioning on it like a lot of REST APIs do. So you can't go to /JSONAPI/2. And then as you're building the next version of your API, do /3. That is coming. There is an issue in the queue to support that. I imagine that it'll be done somewhat like this. We're not going to talk about the resource overrides, but that's something you guys can look at on your own as you go and play with this. All right, so headers. We talked about that all of your requests should have both the accept and the content type header set, and it's always going to be that application/DND plus .API plus JSON, which is a IANI registered resource. and something that Drupal depends on. I'm sorry, I'm going really, really fast. I do presentations a lot, and I'm always nervous as hell. And so every time I go up here, I'm just like, "Blah!" And so if I'm going too fast, just somebody raise up and say, slow down for a sec. All right, let's talk about the anatomy of a JSON API resource response. So every time you make a JSON API call, you're going to get a response in this format. It is a JSON object. It always has this JSON API property, which contains the JSON API version and a link to the schema. So you always know what version of JSON API you're working with. That is really, really useful in case future versions of the spec change. You know what to expect. The next parts are the data section and the included section. You may or may not have an included section, and we'll talk about that during the demo and what that included section actually means. Well, we can talk about what it means now. But the data section contains all of your resource objects. And a resource object is just a fancy name for a JSON structure that represents a single entity. So let's say you're making a request for articles. Data is going to contain an array of objects, these resource objects, that represent each one of the articles. Okay, and each one of those articles will have its fields and all that other kind of stuff. The included section includes all full representation of related things. So let's say you've got, I'm skipping ahead a little bit to my demo. So let's imagine we've got a movie database, okay? And you've got a database of movie nodes, and those movies have actors associated with them, and they've got taxonomy terms associated with them. The included section would actually have representations of those actors and taxonomy terms. And what's really, really cool about this is that if you've got a list of movies and they share some of those resources are only included once in the included section because they're cached. And so that instead of getting a whole big list of duplicate entities, you're only going to get one entity, which is really great for keeping things really simple and keeping responses as small as possible. Every one of these resource objects must contain and will always contain two properties, an ID and a type. The ID is always the UUID of the entity, and then the type is the type. So whether it's a node article or if it's a user or a taxonomy term, and I'll show you some of that when we get into the demo. Again, the great thing about the include section is this is the part that helps you eliminate additional network requests. Like we talked about the problem with REST. If you wanted to get related information, you had to go make additional requests. JSON API includes them all, bundles them all together into one response. And then the meta section contains your total count for of all the resources that were returned, or not returned but found, because, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, there are limitations on how JSON API returns the data. For example, it will only return a maximum of 50 resource objects in one call. So it does that so you can't DDoS yourself. You can't go and request 220,000 things all at once. So the rest of it you have to paginate. But so let's say you've got a movie database and your query matches 100,000 movies. Say it's a really, really general query. You're only going to get 50 of those movies in the data property, but your total count will show 100,000. Does that kind of make sense? And then the links section will always contain the full URL with all of the parameters of the query you just executed. Yeah, I didn't even bother to switch my slides. Sorry. Okay, so includes, again, allows you to get all of your related data in one request. Those related entities are shared, so they're only fetched once. And then the way that you correlate these things, each one of these resource objects has a relationships section where it relates to an included item by UUID, and I'll show you that in the demo. It makes it really easy to make these correlations between the included data and what's in your resource set. All right, so Authentication. Out of the box, Drupal core supports basic authentication as long as you enable the HTTP basic auth module. So you can do a base 64 encoded user password thing. I don't tend to use this very much because, yeah, it's encrypted by SSL, but if you were to use this, then that data gets sent on every single request, and it can be kind of an information leak. It's just as secure as your form-based auth over SSL. So it's not like it's insecure, but it is a somewhat larger vulnerability or risk because you're sending those on every single request. Instead, what I like to use is JWT, JSON Web Tokens. Is anybody familiar with JWT? JWT is basically, it's a JSON object that has information about your user and the expiration and the issuer and all that kind of stuff that is encoded and decoded by a secret. So when you go and you install the key module in the JWT module, the key module allows you to set up a key with different encryption and then different signings, and then it uses a secret to go ahead and enable encoding and decoding, and it stores those, and then you go and you configure the JWT module to use that key. So there are two different ways in which you can work with JWT. The first way is to enable so JWT comes with an auth provider module and an auth consumer module. You definitely want the auth consumer module enabled. The auth provider module enables you to send a request with a user, signed by user password basic authorization to get a JWT key back. You then use that JW key on all of your future requests. And so you're only passing that user password combination once to get your JWT. If you've ever used Elasticsearch, Elasticsearch has the same mechanism where you do an authentication, you get a token back. That token is a JWT. The other way is to share that secret between your server and your client so that the client is generating its own JWTs using the same encoding secret. Then you send the JWT up to the server along in the headers with every single one of your requests, and the auth consumer module goes and decodes that and then basically loads in the user that's part of that request. This is what we're doing at BioRaft. We have our legacy version, which is live, and then we're rebuilding it in Drupal 8. We're using Vue.js and JSON API to build components, and then we're using JWT for authentication for doing the traffic back and forth, for getting the data. This is what a payload looks like. So all of your JWT payloads will contain a Drupal UID, which the auth consumer module then uses to assume the identity of that user. When you go and encode your JWT, you get a bearer token that is this, and you pass that through in your headers. You can also debug your JWTs if you go to jwt.io. They have a great way where you can post in your secret, you can post in your token, and it will actually decrypt it. The way that these tokens are constructed, they're constructed in sections. And the payload is only one of the sections in here. So there's validation and a whole bunch of other stuff that happens. It's really interesting. You should look it up if you're interested.
If you want to know why you should be using authentication, there's a great, when they were evaluating this to go into core in the security team, there's a wonderful 30-page, unfortunately, discussion as to, the dangers of, why it's read-only, the dangers. I mean, for instance, if you have it set up for read-only, people can actually get a list of all your users if you don't have authentication, and if you're using email addresses as your user IDs, suddenly you're supplying to anybody who can access your site a list of your user emails.
That's true. That's true. And of course, it wouldn't be a Drupal core issue discussion if it wasn't 30 pages, right? I've yet to see one that's only got like 4
don't get scared
comments.
off on the 30 pages, because it is, like, every page has kind of a little gem on security.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about collections. So a collection is basically a list of resource objects that you requested. All the queries are resource-based. What that means is they're specific to the resource type that you want. So knowing that, who can tell me which one of these URLs is wrong? Anybody?
Top one? First.
The first one is wrong. Why is the first one wrong?
Because it's too general. It's just...
That's right. You're going to get different fields. You're going to get different structure across all of your entity types, right? Each one of your entity types has different fields, or your bundles have different fields. So what you can't do with JSON API is say, give me a list of all the nodes in my system. It doesn't work that way. You have to know what all the nodes are first, and then you have to iterate through each one of those nodes by going to JSON API /node/article to get those listings. So let's say you have you have a website with movies and actors, and you want to get a listing of all the movies and actors together. That's 2 separate queries. You can't do that in one query unless they're somehow related together. The way you get a specific article is by attaching the UUID on the end of that. There are other ways to do that, and I'll show you another way to get that. This is kind of a pain in the ass because you don't know the UUID of objects unless you turn on devel, right? And then you go and actually look at the render of that particular node. So JSON API, just like REST, is built on standard HTTP actions. Get, post, patch, and delete. Get is for getting a list of things. Post is for creating resources. Patch is for updating. And then delete is for delete. This is the part where we're going to switch to a demo for building and debugging JSON API or REST or anything like that. I use this exclusively. Mostly because I'm a UI guy. You could kind of mock all this stuff up with curl if you're a command line person, but I prefer it this way. I also like the fact that I can save my queries and then I can share them with my team, and this is just such a great tool. All right, so
Actually export them as curl.
and that's right. That's right. That's a good point.
You able to bump the size up any?
I can definitely try. Zoom. That did the opposite. Let's see here. I can
Command plus do anything?
let's try that. Haha. Is that better? Okay. Good tip. That's Facebook. That's not what I want. I want my JSON API demo. All right. So for this presentation, I built a website. And I am not good without a mouse. Really not good without a mouse. Okay, so what I have done here, I have created some content types. I've created a movie. I've created an actor content type that have fields. I've created a taxonomy, all for the purpose of demonstrating this kind of stuff. And to get things started, I have created some movies and some actors. Okay, so now let's imagine that we want to build some sort of client decoupled from this for displaying our data. So let's say we want to get all of our movies. Let's just get a list of all of our movies. It is the path of your website /API or /JSON API if you didn't change it. Node/movie, where node is the entity type and movie is the resource that you want. When I go, and then let's look at the headers. I have my authorization, basic auth. I've got my accept, content type, and we'll talk about what this X consumer ID does a little bit later. So without any params, I'm going to go ahead and send this, and I'm going to get a list of movies in our JSON API format. Okay, so as we said, we always have a JSON API property which has the version and then links to the schema. I'm going to go ahead and collapse that because we don't really care about that right now. Now we have our data. Data is a collection of resource objects. So it's data in this particular case is represented as an array of objects. And each one of these objects represents a single node. So we have this particular movie right here. This is the movie Speed. It has an NID and a VID. Now, in previous versions of JSON API, this used to be just NID and VID. However, they changed these in the core version to be this Drupal internal under NID and VID for some of the internal properties, so that they don't clash with the ID property. So if you used an older version of JSON API and now you need to upgrade to 2.0 or 2.4 now, you're going to have to make some changes to the way that you're processing your data. We have all the properties that you might expect out of this. This is really the full representation of a node, right? It has all the fields and so on and so forth. We talked about the relationships a little bit. So we know that it's got a node type. We know that it's got some links. These are the links to itself. It's got revision information and so on and so forth. It's got user information for the UID. It's got some entity reference stuff, but no real data yet. And I'll show you why that is. So if we go ahead and we collapse data, you can see here our meta count. I have 13 movies in the database, and then the links to the query that we just did. Let's take a look at our parameters again and scroll this back up. Okay, so the include parameter tells you what related data you want to include in your response. So I told you we have a reference field to the actors that are in the movie. We have a taxonomy term for genre. And then we have an image field, which is the poster. And I want all that data to be coming across in this response. So I specify those with this include property. When I go ahead and I run this now, and I hide my params, and I come back down into the response, and we start taking a look at the data. So now we still have information in all the data, but we also have an included section. Okay? Here's information about the actors who are in this movie. For example, Keanu Reeves is in this movie, and here's all of his information. Okay, Keanu has this UUID, and this UUID corresponds to an ID in the relationship section. So if we look at the users and we look at field actors, there's our correspond. That's how you go and you correlate what is related to this particular node with what's in the included section. So if we have a bunch of movies that have the same actor, how many times are we going to see that actor in the included section?
One.
Just once. Pretty cool. All right, what else can we do here? Let's talk about...
It only goes one level deep though, right? Because if you had, like, in that actor, like a role, whether he was a director or an actor or screenwriter as a taxonomy for that, you would get the UUID and then have to go back and ask for that? Or
No, sir. You can actually chain those. So let's say that, let me go back up here and show my params. Maybe it'll show params. No, it doesn't want to show my parameters. Come on, show me my parameters. There we go. If I wanted, let's say Keanu had another field, role. You can do it like this. You can do field actors.role and include now the information that's part of that. So For example, at Bioref, we have content types that reference, and those references reference something else. You can walk the entire tree and get all the related stuff that way. And you use that with the dot accessor. It is super powerful. So what else can we include in here? We can control how many results we want per page. That's with this page limit. We could say we only want 2 per page. We could say we want 50 per page. Again, if you set 100 per page, you're only going to get a max of 50. For pagination, you can paginate these things manually by saying which page of the result set you want. So if you've got 100 things and you've got and you're doing 25 per page and you want results at 50 through 75, your page offset would be 3. Sorting, there's a shorthand for sorting. You can sort by fields, named fields. You can sort by multiple fields, actor.title. If you want to sort by descending order, you can just put a hyphen. That means negative, right? There is a longhand version of this, but this is super simple. If you want to sort by multiple fields and different directions, you can do that. One of the things that we also talked about was sparse field sets. So right now, let's say in my app, I just want a listing of movie titles. So all I want is the title. I don't want all of this other stuff. I can specify on my content types which fields I want. So all I want is title. So now when I did take out the include section. So now if I go ahead and hit send, here's my data. Each one of these resource objects now only has title. So again, you can really make your response objects small and performant based off the fields you want. You can't do that with REST unless you go and build some views. All right, so that's like getting all the movies. Don't save. Let's talk about, let's say we want to get some movies by actor. There are a couple different ways that we can get fields by actor. So let's say I want to get all the fields or all the movies where Keanu Reeves is in the movie. So your filters always have an arbitrary key. They always have a condition, and they always have either a path and a value, and sometimes they have an operator. Operator by default is equals, and there are different operators that are supported. Equals, greater than, less than, contains, starts with. They're all documented on the JSON API documentation, and I'll show you some of those a little bit later. But all of your filters, and there is shorthand for this, but I don't tend to use it a lot because it only works for simple queries. Just remember that you're always going to have your filters set up by an arbitrary key, and then you're going to have a path condition and a value. Path is the field and the property on the field that you want. So in this particular case, we're going through the field actors reference, and I want the title of the items that are referenced by that field. So in this case, it's our actor content type, and we want the title. And then the condition is Keanu Reeves, and again, the equals condition is implied. So if I go ahead and send this, now I'm only going to get a few results, 4 results. So I got 4 movies with Keanu. Let's say that I also want to get movies that have Sandra Bullock, because I love Sandra Bullock. We can specify multiples, so that where the conditions are anded or ORed. In this particular case, we're setting our operator to be in. So we want all movies where the actor is either Keanu or Sandra. And we say it's multiple value by putting these empty brackets.
You need your field.
Excuse me?
You need the actors filled out title, don't you?
I do. I went and unchecked that one. Thank you. Condition path. Okay, so now if I go and live demos.
Actually, you should have done it. It would be a good way to show error conditions.
So now instead of 4, now I've got 6. Okay, makes sense. So this is the list of movies where the actor either includes Sandra or Keanu. Now, yesterday morning I was putting together the last one that I wanted to show you, And I kind of pooped in my mouth a little bit because it wasn't working. I wanted to show movies, only movies where Keanu and Sandra are together in the movie, and it wasn't working. And I was like, what the hell am I doing wrong here? So what did I do? I did my Google searches, couldn't find anything. So what did I do next? I went to the Drupal issue queue, couldn't find any duplicates, so I opened up a new issue. Lo and behold, the JSON API maintainers kind of pooped in their mouths a little bit, and they said, why the hell isn't this working? This is supposed to work. Well, after about 3 hours of them mucking around with it, they figured out that there is a bug in the way that the entity query API handles some of these translations. And so I have a workaround here, which I'm going to show you. It's not very pretty, but now there's an open issue on the core list for JSON API where they're going to make this work the way it should. So we have these conditions called conjunctions, where we can set up our filters in groups. So you can have and groups, you can have or groups, and then you can and or those groups together. So in this particular case, I have an and group for movies that have Keanu, and I have an and condition for movies that have Sandra. And I'm going to go ahead and set up our filters, and I'm going to set a condition of member of. Member of means that this condition is going to be in this query group. And I'm going to do the same thing with Sandra. Okay, so again, we have a path, we have a value, and then we have member of, and then the condition is equals by default. So now if I go ahead and I send this, I should only have one movie that both of those two actors were in, and that was The Lake House, which I've never seen before.
Isn't she in Speed?
Yeah, oh, you're right. She was also in Speed. Sorry. Yeah, I messed that up, didn't I? Yeah, she was also in Speed. So if I had set up my database correctly, I would have had 2 results. Thank you for that. You're right. Okay, so those are ways that you can navigate some filters. More ways you can navigate filters. You can get filters. You can get things by revision now, which you never used to be able to do. So by default, you're going to get, yes, sir?
On that last part, I didn't mean to interrupt this.
Yes, sir.
What was the workaround?
The workaround was to set up all of these crazy conjunctions.
How are you
And
supposed to do it?
what you're supposed to be able to do is just say where the actor is this and the actor is this, because it's a multi-valued field. That is probably the most intuitive way that most people would do that. But yeah, that doesn't work.
So you basically would do what you do with the and replace it as and.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so revisions, you always get the latest revision, but let's say I wanted to get an older revision. You can use this resource version parameter and then specify the ID of your revision. So that's really, really cool, especially if your decoupled system has to do work with revisions. I had another one I wanted to show. Oh yeah, get movie by title. This is cool. So we can, another way we can do things is we can use this contains, or we can use starts with. So in this way, I want to get all movies where the title starts with Star Wars. And in my weak database, I only have 2. I've got episode 4 and episode 5 because I am a traditionalist. So yeah, that's filtering by title. You guys kind of understand how the filters work? Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff. And then you go and you combine that with sparse field sets. You can really build all sorts of different interfaces. Okay, now let's talk about creating movies.
Good question. You're manually adding those, and you had populated those parameters. There is no template for.
There is no template. So this is kind of a gotcha. When you go, and this is one of the things that we're seeing, because we have a large customer base, and some of our customers are technologically savvy, and they want to be able to work with BioRAF data. So the challenge that we have is that by exposing JSON API endpoints to them, they kind of have to understand Drupalisms. They kind of have to understand the way fields are named and the way fields are referenced together. So the JSON API gives us that spec of common understanding, how to understand the responses, how to understand the format. But on top of that, you still have to understand what's available to you because of Drupal. You know, this whole Drupal underscore internal underscore underscore NID. What does that mean, right? And what are these fields? JSONAPI Extras does give you some ways to go and monkey around with the responses and monkey around with the paths. That's a completely different topic. I feel like having auto-generated documentation from OpenAPI or Schemata really, really helps them, because then you can just send that to your customers, and then it gives them that really nice, or Swagger or whatever, it gives them that nice documentation and they can then follow. And you don't have to lift a finger other than enabling the modules.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily specific to Drupal, because Solar and Solar's API can get to be just as obtuse without knowing. Solar.
Yeah, definitely, and Elastic's the same way. I feel like you're right about that. A lot of them are.
But
right.
at least you could say, here's a GUID, or here's how you get a list of stuff. Okay, then my response has all the fields, and I can kind of figure out what it means.
Right, exactly. And if you've got that self-generating documentation, it's super easy at that point. So I just put this together because I've been working with JSON API for a long time. I didn't have time to go and enable all the really nice documentation stuff that I wanted to show, but that's okay. All right, so let's go ahead and we want to create a movie. So again, I've got my headers, as you would expect. I'm doing a post. Now my body is a JSON representation of what I want to create. So it has to have a type. It doesn't have an ID because Drupal's going to generate that for us. It's got some attributes, so we're going to create the running man. It's got some properties on the fields, and it's got some actor information. Oh, but wait a second. I need to create the actor first because I'm referencing the actor by UUID. So let's go ahead and create the actor first. Arnold. Again, it's post. It's got all the stuff you'd expect, so we're going to go ahead and send that. And when you go and you create a resource in your endpoint, it then returns that entity. So now I know that I've created Arnold Schwarzenegger, and this is his UUID. So I'm going to use that in my create movie to associate Arnold with the running man. So that's this bit right here. Now I'm going to go ahead and send this. And boom, I've got my thing. So now if I go back to here and I go ahead and refresh my listings, there's the running man and there's Arnold. Okay. Now on Arnold, I created a sparse record with only the minimum number of fields that were required. If I had required fields, obviously I would have had to send those over in the request. And if you don't, Drupal's internal validation stuff will kick up and then throw you back an error, which is really, really nice. So I want to add Arnold's date of birth. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use that UUID to patch his record. And here I'm going to set his date of birth. And so now if I come back and I look at Arnold, here's his date of birth. One little gotcha there is that if you pass in the wrong format of something, you're going to get an ugly cryptic error, and then you're going to have to go track that down. I ran into that when I was building this.
Do you know if you have multiple languages, how you would send, because like, you don't have to send the language right now, but if you have multiple languages, would you do a array? Or?
I'll get there.
Okay.
I'll get there. We can also delete actors. I'm not going to actually do it, but basically you're referencing the entity that you want to go by UUID, and then you do a delete on it. All right, so we are running short on time, so I'm just going to keep going with the demo. We're going to talk about uploading files. So let's say here that now I want to add a poster to this movie. We have a field poster on the on the movie entity type. This is a two-step process. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to upload the binary file to the actual field. Okay? So in this particular thing, I'm just going to use this interface. You could do lots of different ways to get the content of the image. I'm just going to select this and I'm going to post it. This will create an instance of the image on the server. And if it had worked, I would have gotten back a response that said, here's the ID of that image. You then have to do a patch on your movie, and then you add the relationship and the ID of that file. So it is a two-step process to do that, just like it was a two-step process to add the actor. Other really, really cool things that you can do with JSON API. Let's say that you're making your client and you want to have a content entity form in your client. And you want to know what the fields are. You can get all the fields by bundle by going to this field config / field config, and then you set up some filters. So in this case, my path is bundle, my condition is movie, my value is movie. I go and send that, and here's all information about all the fields on my bundle. So that's really cool. So now I know what fields are supposed to be there. But one of the common problems that you have is, let's say you have a select list in your client form, and you need to add in the options on that select list. You have two options. You can hard code it, or you can get those options directly from Drupal. And the way you do that is by going to field storage config / field storage config and setting up some filters. So in this case, I've got two filters, one on entity type, where that entity type is node. And then I want some paths and I want some fields. In this particular case, I've got a rating field, which has G through NC17 or X, and I want to get that information. This gives me that field and gives me my allowed values, which I can then use to build my select form in my client. All right. That's pretty much it for the demo. I'm going to stop this again.